In the autumn of 2014, a sonar image rose from the floor of the Arctic Ocean, the shape of a wooden ship, sitting upright and almost perfectly intact, resting in the dark. It had been waiting there undisturbed for 166 years. It was one of two vessels that had carried 129 men into the ice, and then into a silence that swallowed them completely. Not a single one of them ever came home. To understand how that happened, you have to go back to a time when one stretch of frozen sea was the most coveted prize on Earth. In the spring of 1845, Britain believed it was about to win something it had chased for 3 centuries, the Northwest Passage, a sea route threading through the frozen top of the world, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For 300 years, ship after ship had sailed north to find it, and many of them had never returned. The Arctic had a long habit of swallowing the confident and the brave without explanation. To claim the prize at last, the Royal Navy chose Sir John Franklin, a 59-year-old veteran of the Arctic, and handed him the 2 strongest ships in the fleet. They were named Erebus and Terror, bomb ships built to absorb the recoil of heavy mortars, their hulls now sheathed in iron, fitted with steam engines salvaged from railway locomotives and cabins warmed against the cold. They carried provisions for 3 years, tons of salted meat, biscuit, and thousands of tins of food, a new invention that promised survival where nothing grew. By the standards of the age, nothing could possibly go wrong. On the 19th of May, the ships sailed from England with a crew of 134, cheered off as though they were leaving on a summer cruise. The whole nation expected them back, triumphant within 2 years. Aboard were 134 officers and men, most of them young, the youngest just a boy of 18. They were sailors and stokers, a surgeon, an ice master, men who had left wives and mothers on the quay believing the hardest part of all of it would simply be the waiting. They stopped in Greenland, where 5 sick men were sent home, leaving 129. Then they turned north into the channels of ice. On the 26th of July, 2 whaling ships met them in Baffin Bay, both crews waiting for the pack ice to open. The whalers watched the masts drift north into the channel. No European ever saw the expedition alive again. For 2 years, England was not worried. Franklin had food, fuel, and the finest equipment of the age, and silence from the Arctic was normal. The ice did not deliver letters, but 2 years became 3, and 3 became 4, and slowly, a nation's easy confidence curdled into a cold and creeping dread. Driven on by Franklin's wife, Lady Jane, the search that followed became the largest the world had ever seen. Dozens of ships, from Britain and America, combing thousands of miles of ice for any trace of the missing men. Bit by bit, they found pieces. On a barren scrap of land called Beechey Island, they uncovered the expedition's very first winter camp, tin cans, scraps, and stone foundations. Here, the expedition had spent its first winter, locked in by the ice through months of total darkness and brutal cold. Most of the men endured it. But before the sun returned, 3 of them were dead, and that in itself was a quiet warning. Strong young sailors were not supposed to die in the very first year. And there they were, 3 graves neatly dug, their wooden headboards still standing. John Torrington, John Hartnell, William Brain, 3 young men who had died that first winter. But the graves gave no reason and pointed in no direction. More than a century later, a team of scientists returned to those graves and opened the frozen ground. What they lifted out was not bone, but the men themselves, their faces still startlingly whole, preserved in the permafrost as if they had only just fallen asleep. Tissue samples told a troubling story. The men carried unusually high levels of lead in their bodies, and they had been worn down by pneumonia and other disease. One theory took hold at once, that the expedition's own tinned food, sealed with thick lead solder, had been slowly poisoning the crew from the very start. But the graves still gave no direction. Beyond Beechey, the trail went cold. The ships had sailed on into a maze of ice-choked channels, and the Arctic had closed behind them like a door. What no one in England knew was that the ships had not gone far. Off the coast of King William Island, the pack ice had seized Erebus and Terror and refused to let go. One winter passed locked in the ice, and then a second. The vessels held fast, going nowhere. while the food in the holds ran lower and the men grew weaker in the endless cold. The first true word of their fate came not from the Navy, but from the people who had lived in that landscape for thousands of years. In 1854, a Scottish explorer named John Rae met Inuit hunters who described something they had seen years before. Dozens of white men, starving, dragging boats southward across the ice, falling one by one as they went. They had seen the remains, and they reported plainly that in their final days the men had been driven to feed on their own dead in order to survive a little longer. And Rae had proof. From the hunters he gathered a collection of objects found with the bodies: silver forks and spoons stamped with the officers' family crests, a small medal and a round silver plate that carried a single engraved name, Sir John Franklin. There was no longer any doubt whose men these had been. Victorian Britain recoiled. The public refused to believe that British officers, the very flower of the Navy, could ever fall so far. Rae was attacked in the press, even by the novelist Charles Dickens, and his careful report was dismissed as native invention. Lady Jane Franklin herself helped lead the campaign against him, determined to keep her husband's name a story of heroism, not horror. Rae was denied the honors he had earned, and the truth he carried was buried under a more comfortable myth. But the hunters had not been lying, and it would take more than a century to prove just how completely right they were. Still, the searches went on for years, then decades. Explorers like Charles Hall and Frederick Schwatka traveled north and did what few before them had done. They lived among the Inuit, and they listened. Again and again they heard the same story of starving men walking south and falling, told by people who had no reason at all to invent it. Then, in 1859, a search party on King William Island found a cairn of stones, and sealed inside it a single sheet of paper, the only written record the expedition would ever leave behind. It held two messages written almost a year apart on the same printed form. The first, from 1847, was calm and confident, and it ended with two short words: "All well." The second message was scrawled around the margins of the same page a year later, the handwriting cramped and hurried, and it told a very different story. Franklin was dead. 24 men were already gone, and the ships, trapped and slowly crushed by the ice, had been abandoned. Command had fallen to Francis Crozier, the captain of the Terror, and he made a desperate choice: to lead the survivors off the ships and walk south across the frozen sea toward a distant river and the faint hope of rescue. 105 men set out on foot, hauling heavy lifeboats on sledges, marching for a river hundreds of miles away. It was a journey that even the strong and well-fed would have struggled to survive. None of them reached it. Along that route, searchers later found a trail of bones and abandoned gear, and a single lifeboat mounted on a sledge, pointed not south, but back north, toward the ships, as if at the very end the men had turned around. Inside that boat lay two skeletons and a strange cargo of useless heavy things: silver cutlery, books, slippers, a curtain rod. Dying men had dragged the comforts of home across the ice until they could drag them no further. What killed them was the Arctic itself. Scurvy, starvation, cold, and disease, grinding down men already weakened by years trapped in the dark. For decades, the lead in their tins was blamed for clouding their judgment as well. Later studies have cast doubt on that, pointing instead to disease and simple deficiency. The exact chain of failures is still debated, but one grim detail is no longer in question. When scientists examined the scattered bones a century later, they found fine cut marks scored across them, the unmistakable trace of knives confirming beyond any doubt that the last survivors had done exactly what the Inuit always said. And the closer the scientists looked, the darker it became. The marks were not the work of a single desperate moment. Some bones had been broken open and even worn smooth by the rims of cooking pots, the signature of men returning to the same remains, again and again, at the very end of everything. For a long time, people told themselves that whatever had happened, the officers at least must have been spared it. Then in 2024, that last comfort fell away. Researchers matched DNA from a jawbone, found among the scattered remains, to a living descendant. The bone belonged to Captain James Fitzjames, a senior officer of the Erebus, one of the most respected men on the expedition. And across that jaw ran the same fine cut marks. Even he, in the end, had been butchered by his own starving crew. There was one more haunting clue among the bones. A sailor was identified who had been found wearing another man's clothing, dressed in a uniform that was not his own, as if at the very end the dying had simply shared whatever warmth and cloth they had left. It is easy across so many years to let 129 men blur into a single number. But each of them had a name, a face, and a home he was certain he would see again. The work being done now, with sonar and DNA and old patient testimony, is slowly giving them back that much, one man at a time. And yet, through all of it, the two ships themselves remained lost. For more than 160 years, no one could find Erebus or Terror. The answer, once again, lay in Inuit memory. Their stories described a ship that had drifted south and sunk in a particular place. Knowledge carried down through generations, and this time, finally listened to. In 2014, guided by exactly those accounts, searchers found Erebus, sitting upright on the shallow seabed, right where the Inuit had always said it was. 2 years later, they found Terror in a bay that already bore its name, its decks, its dishes, and its bottles still in place. The whole ship preserved in the cold and the dark like a sealed museum. Divers have since raised the ship's bell and brought up hundreds of objects from the wrecks, and the work goes on. Slowly, name by name, the men who vanished into the ice are being found again. The passage they died searching for is opening now, as the very ice that swallowed them melts away. But the deepest mystery was never really the route. It was the silence and the long, patient memory of the people who watched it all and were finally believed. If you find yourself drawn to the mysteries our world has never quite let go of, stay a while. There are more of them waiting in the dark. Sleep well.